Welcome to the DebateDrills Academy. My name is Rafi Piliero, and this is the Nationals 2021 LD topic analysis. In this video, we're going to introduce the topic about public health emergencies and civil liberties, as well as discuss some cases on both sides. So, the resolution, resolved, a public health emergency justifies limiting civil liberties. What do those terms mean? We're going to discuss that. The roadmap for today is that we're first going to analyze what the words in the topic mean, provide some context for understanding really where this topic comes from, and then we'll discuss potential arguments on both sides, so some AF cases, some Neg cases, as well as some general strategic considerations. So to begin, public health emergency. At first, it feels like this is maybe something that is a little bit loosely defined. What does it really mean to have a public health emergency? But there actually is a statutory basis for defining what this is. That it's a legal declaration by the HHS, pursuant to Section 319 of the Public Health Service Act, regarding disease or bioterrorism. Health and Human Services is HHS. So it concerns diseases or bioterrorism. So if there's a public health emergency with a pandemic spreading, for example, or a bioterrorism event, the HHS is able to make a legal declaration of a public health emergency. However, that's not the only definition of it. Some definitions that are adopted are a little bit broader. So one definition put out by a different agency in the government claims that it can be of something of significant or catastrophic event. So in the past, for example, government agency claimed there was a public health emergency surrounding flooding. That would also be a claim that could involve a public health emergency declaration. So it does not only have to be disease or bioterrorism, but depending on your definition, it can be broader or a little bit more narrow. But the definition that you'll see most often in the literature is about this HHS definition that pertains to disease or bioterrorism. But again, it's not the only definition. If you looked at it more, less from a legal standpoint, but also more just how it's used in regular discussion, you can see that it's also can involve a state-level declaration, so a state can claim, for example, we have a public health emergency. So it can mean multiple things. The takeaway is that it depends on the definition, but the majority of debates will likely involve disease or bioterrorism, because that is probably the most common definition that is referenced. But of course, up to you to find definitions that are perhaps a little bit more broad. Justifies. This one is fairly straightforward, but an important wrinkle is that the resolution is really worded as a value proposition. It's not proposing a specific policy, like the government should limit civil liberties. It's rather the government would be justified in doing so, identifying really, I think, a trade-off between civil liberties and the need to act expediently in a public health emergency. So the question really of the topic is, on balance, is it okay to limit some civil liberties in the case of a public health emergency? It could, of course, be construed as a policy action. The AF could claim, in this particular case, it is justified for us to limit civil liberties by X, Y, and Z means in this event of a public health emergency. So can the government pass a policy to limit civil liberties in this particular case? So, civil liberties. These are constitutional rights that pertain to freedom. So it's really about non-interference from the government. This is not U.S. specific. It's not just the U.S. Constitution, but it's rather rights that that governments themselves are pledging not to abridge. So really negative rights, the assurances the government will not interfere with your individual rights. So these are outlined in the U.S. Constitution. Other countries have similar documents. But it's really the purpose is just that countries that have a robust civil liberties tradition, that is really what the emphasis is. But limiting, of course, does not mean eliminating. The point is not no more civil liberties, of course. It's rather a balance. Can there be slight incursions on civil liberties for the sake of facilitating a more expedient public health response? Some additional things that we want to emphasize with the wording of the topic. The topic is not government-specific. It doesn't say United States, it doesn't say France, it doesn't say Canada, etc., etc. It is more broadly. There's not really an actor that is framed in the resolution. But the affirmative could theoretically specify a government. That maybe begs the question of a broader topicality discussion of can like a single country prove a broader statement, but many people do accept that it can. And you could specify perhaps the United States, you could specify a country, potentially. Another important question is how might civil liberties be limited? In the case of a public health emergency, it often will be a declaration that is given, where there is some window. So in the case of the declaration by HHS, there's a 90-day window in which this emergency will persist before it has to be reauthorized by Congress to continue. So it could just be a declaration of a certain time in which the government can perhaps be a little bit more liberal in terms of infringing on rights, and respect those rights perhaps a little bit less strictly, but after that window passes, perhaps the rights then snap back in place. So an emergency declaration is likely how it would be, but of course there could be some other mechanisms for the affirmative, perhaps a Supreme Court ruling that claims X, Y, and Z rights should be deprioritized in X, Y, and Z scenarios. But an emergency declaration is probably how it would most likely go about. So some context. This is obviously written in response to the coronavirus pandemic. It's something that we've all lived through for the past year plus. It's something that's on our minds. Clearly, the topic committee chose something that was pertinent to our everyday lives, which is good because you'll know a lot about the topic. You'll understand what a public health emergency is because you've lived through one. You've read about some of the trade-offs between rights and protections that are being taken in terms of public health precautions. But it's not just a coronavirus topic, and you don't want to filter it exclusively through your own experiences. You also want to recognize there are, of course, other diseases, but more broadly, it's not just a disease topic. There could be things like bioterrorism incidents, which is explicitly within even the more narrow definition. Or remember, there are broader definitions, too, that talk about public health emergencies relating to, say, flooding, relating to natural disasters, that many of these events that are just sort of black swan events and affect large swaths of the U.S. population could be included in this. Just really, when you think about it, just many events that are just force majeure, that are just really sort of out of nowhere that affect large swaths of the population, those could be construed as public health emergencies depending on the definition that you're looking at. AF strategy. Let's talk about some broad strategic considerations for how the AF might want to approach this. The first is that recognize that magnitude first arguments disproportionately will benefit the AF here. It is very difficult for the neg to get to an extinction impact. The neg's impacts will likely be high probability, more long-term about the erosion of civil liberties, but arguments that are like we need to prevent extinction and mass death likely will disproportionately help the AF, because they will claim there is some overwhelming public health crisis that needs a quick response. So an argument then is that if you were to read a position with a util framework, it becomes easy to say ends justify the means. We need to really take whatever action we can to avoid whatever public health problems emerging right now. So this is a case where the framework debate will often be determinative, because if the neg wins that util is not the framework and that some more means-based framework is true, then that will tend to favor their impacts. And the flip side is true. A more ends-based framework will favor the AF, which means that the AF will almost always be benefited by reading a utilitarian position. The AF should also make two arguments to really hedge against neg offense. First is that the restrictions are limited but effective, that these are not huge violations of rights, but they are nonetheless very effective at curbing whatever public health emergency that the AF is speaking about. And second, that the restrictions are short-term but not long-term. These are not restrictions that are permanent infringements on rights, but rather they phase out once the emergency goes away. So neg strategy, in a lot of ways, is the opposite of that. You want to focus on ethics first in terms of deprioritizing consequences and deprioritizing more ends-based theories, and establish there are other priorities that come before just preventing extinction. So often that will take the case of an NC. The second is a slippery slope. You want to push back vigorously against the idea that these rights violations just happen once and then go away, but rather that once rights are taken away for the first time, they can more easily be taken away the second, third, fourth time, etc., and that the erosion of rights in this case can certainly spill over. Another one to do is to put risk on, to contest some of the AF's scenarios. This obviously will depend on the case that you're debating, so you're not going to say coronavirus fake, let's not read conspiracy theories, but of course you can claim that when the AF is talking about maybe a threat that is a lot less imminent, you can claim that maybe that's constructed. So for example, bioterrorism. You could say, look, this is a scare tactic. Bioterrorism is not really a thing, and this is just a preemptive violation of rights, that you should not prime the pump for taking away people's rights before this has actually happened. And of course, a big solvency press. These restrictions don't work. They actually make things worse. Perhaps they cause backlash, which results in them being less effective, which allows you to link term the affirmative case. So a big link term press, I think, is also very important here, because there are good cards about backlash, about maybe acting too quickly and undemocratically, leading to worse public policy. So some specific AF cases. You can specify a country, a method of limitation, or a public health scenario. So the country that should limit those civil liberties, the way they get limited, so like an emergency declaration, a court case, etc., or even a public health scenario. Like, are we talking bioterrorism, specifically coronavirus? Are we talking another disease, perhaps something related to like infrastructure, like flooding? So you can see several of the examples of that are listed there. Another thing to realize, though, when you specify a country is that the country probably needs to have a robust civil liberties tradition. So a country that that is not a democracy, it's not going to make as much sense to talk about limiting, in that case, their civil liberties if they don't really have a civil liberties tradition. So a lot of that was util-based, but of course there are possibilities for apps that are more philosophically oriented about like other theories such as communitarianism. The big thing is that this is often a debate about individualism versus the collective good, and there are ethical theories other than util that prioritize the collective good, such as communitarianism, situating rights within a broader social context. So I think that's also another theory that is certainly available, that you can make arguments about why that justifies some types of limits on civil liberties, because the purpose of rights is not just individual protection, but rather advancing the public good for some of those theories. So some neg cases. So potential NCs. Libertarianism, of course, non-interference, don't interfere with people's rights. That would justify a much more stringent understanding of what rights should be protected and the conditions under which the government is allowed to interfere with those. But something a little bit less absolutionist, but still could be a good neg argument here, would be a deontological theory, especially focused on Kantian political philosophy. Some of the works of Arthur Ripstein, for example, that talk about the importance of a system of freedom that, again, pushes against the idea of interference. There are certain conditions under which the government can infringe upon your rights that you would argue that in this case the affirmative goes overboard. And there are, of course, disadvantages. Most of the strong ones will be about the court precedent that is set by a particular intrusion into civil liberties, that is not just a one-off intrusion, but rather spills over into other cases, and that, as a result, it ends up just hampering civil liberties more broadly. Then you can read impacts to that, about why that is bad for there to be that type of infringement into civil liberties. And then, of course, there can be counterplans as well, such as do the public health measures without infringing on civil liberties. Just directly take steps to prevent the problem. Coronavirus, maybe what you do in response is you speed up the vaccination process. A bioterrorism event, maybe you increase surveillance and monitoring to prevent, you increase tracking to prevent the potential bioterrorists from being able to acquire weapons or being able to detect it when it's about to happen. Something related to infrastructure, perhaps you just develop stronger infrastructure ahead of time, that you just try to create these public health measures without the infringements on rights that come with it, to hedge against arguments that say we need to break an egg to make an omelet, so to speak, and violate some rights in order to effectively prevent these problems from emerging. So to conclude, it's important to really situate this within the current context. You've lived through this pandemic, you've seen the question certainly about whether or not civil liberties can be violated in some cases for the greater good, so you have that context, which can help you make this topic a lot less abstract. But it's important just to compare the fundamental values that both sides disagree on. Individualism versus the collective good. Do the means justify the ends? Do we care about really a high magnitude occurrence, or perhaps low probability or high probability continual violations of rights that are of lower magnitude, perhaps? So some of those questions to examine will help you understand these debates and really situate them within a context that makes sense for you.